He said the voices told him to do it. But the voices weren't strangers, they were his own. And by the time the police caught him, 17 men and boys were already dead. But the true horror wasn't just in their deaths, it was in what Jeffrey Dahmer did next. The chilling story of Jeffrey Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, begins with a series of gruesome crimes that shocked the nation. A man who was not only a killer, but also a man who engaged in unspeakable acts, going far beyond the simple taking of lives. Dahmer's life and crimes were hidden behind the facade of a quiet, unremarkable man until the truth finally came to light. As the investigation unfolded, the world would come face to face with a nightmare more horrific than anyone could have imagined. It was the summer of 1991 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city where nothing could prepare the residents for the terror that had been lurking in their midst for over a decade. A quiet mechanic, Jeffrey Dahmer, was someone who lived largely unnoticed in the apartment complex he inhabited. To the outside world, he seemed just like anyone else. But behind closed doors, a far darker reality was taking place. The first clue came on a warm summer night when a terrified young man, Tracy Edwards, escaped from Dahmer's apartment. Bloodied and panicked, Edwards ran to the police, pleading for help. And it was this desperate act that would eventually lead investigators to the discovery of the true scale of Dahmer's horrors. When the police entered Dahmer's apartment, they were greeted with an unimaginable scene. As they moved through the small apartment, they found photographs of dismembered bodies, body parts stored in containers, and evidence that would link Dahmer to a series of disappearances stretching back years. But what shocked them even more was the realization that the man they had arrested, a quiet, unassuming mechanic, had been living a double life. His killings were not just murders, they were meticulously planned, calculated acts of violence that had escalated over time. As investigators began piecing together the evidence, they discovered the full extent of Dahmer's crimes. 17 men and boys had been killed, most of them from marginalized communities. Dahmer lured his victims into his apartment with promises of money or alcohol, and once inside, he would drug, kill, and perform unspeakable acts. But the terror didn't stop there. Dahmer's desire didn't end with death. He kept body parts as trophies, preserved them, and even ate some of his victims. The horror was far deeper than anyone could have anticipated. The chilling truth was that Dahmer's murder spree had been going on for over a decade, unnoticed by those around him. His methodical approach, combined with his ability to blend into society, made him the perfect predator, until the day that one young man managed to escape. And when the truth came to light, it would shatter the perception of the man who had been living right under the noses of those around him.
The true horror of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes could not be understood without first recognizing the victims. Each one of them had a name, a life, and a story, but all were cut short by a man who saw them only as objects for his twisted desires. Dahmer's victims were not strangers to him. They were part of the fabric of his everyday life. Men he lured with promises of companionship, money, or alcohol. He sought out vulnerable individuals, often young men, many of whom were from marginalized communities, men whose disappearances might go unnoticed by the larger world. Dahmer's first known victim was Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker who was last seen leaving a local bar on June 18, 1978. Dahmer offered him a ride, and after a few drinks together, he struck Hicks over the head, killed him, and dismembered his body. It was a pattern that would repeat itself again and again over the years. In total, Dahmer would claim 17 victims, each one following a similar tragic sequence of events. Most of Dahmer's victims were men who were either homeless, part of the LGBTQ+ community, or involved in the drug scene, making them easy targets for someone like Dahmer. He lured them with promises of companionship or money, sometimes offering them drugs or alcohol. Once inside his apartment, the horror would begin. He would drug his victims, strangle them, and then engage in unspeakable acts, including necrophilia and cannibalism. Dahmer's crime spree was a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and death. Many of the victims had their lives and stories erased from the public eye due to their circumstances. But in the end, they were not just nameless victims. They were human beings, loved by family and friends, and their deaths would spark an outcry for justice. Dahmer's actions were a brutal violation of humanity, and the loss of each life left a scar on the city of Milwaukee. The names of Dahmer's victims have not been forgotten. People like James Doxtator, a 14-year-old boy Dahmer murdered in 1988, and Errol Lindsay, a 19-year-old who was killed in 1991, were all individuals who had dreams, families, and futures ahead of them. Dahmer stole those futures from them, and it would take years for the world to truly understand the depth of the nightmare that had unfolded in Milwaukee. Each victim was more than just a name on a police report. They were people with stories and dreams. And with each killing, Dahmer's thirst for control and power only grew stronger, until the day that someone would finally escape his grasp and bring an end to his reign of terror. It wasn't until the summer of 1991 that the horrifying pattern of disappearances began to unravel. On the night of May 27, 1991, Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man, found himself inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. Edwards had been lured there with the promise of money and was initially offered a drink and some company. But within moments, he realized that he had made a grave mistake. Dahmer, in his typical fashion, drugged Edwards, but something was different this time. Edwards was able to fight off the effects of the sedatives, and in a desperate bid for survival, he managed to escape from the apartment, running out of the door and into the night. Bloodied and terrified, he flagged down 2 police officers who were patrolling the streets nearby. What Edwards told them would set off a chain of events that would uncover the darkest secrets hidden behind Dahmer's otherwise ordinary appearance. When Edwards led the officers back to Dahmer's apartment, they had no idea what they were about to uncover. Dahmer attempted to talk his way out of the situation, but the police officers were already growing suspicious. They noticed a key detail that would ultimately expose the killer. Edwards had shown them a pair of handcuffs and told them about the bizarre things he had witnessed inside the apartment. When Dahmer was asked to open the door, the officers could immediately sense something was off. Inside, the officers were confronted with an array of evidence that would soon lead to the full revelation of Dahmer's horrific crimes. Photographs of dismembered bodies, body parts in containers, and a stench that could not be ignored filled the air. A quick search of the apartment confirmed the unimaginable. Dahmer was arrested immediately. The police had discovered that the quiet, solitary man, whom they had never thought to suspect, was actually a brutal killer who had been committing heinous crimes for over a decade. As the investigation began, more and more details came to light. Dahmer, when questioned, confessed to killing 17 men and boys, but what made his crimes even more disturbing was the extent of his depravity. Dahmer didn't just kill his victims. He dismembered their bodies,
kept trophies, and even engaged in acts of cannibalism. The discovery left investigators stunned and shaken, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they were facing. The media quickly picked up the story, and as details of Dahmer's crimes spread across the country, the true scale of the horrors became clear. The man who had lived quietly among them, a seemingly unremarkable member of society, was revealed as one of the most notorious serial killers in history. But Dahmer's capture was just the beginning of a dark journey that would reveal just how far his crimes went and how long they had remained hidden from the public eye. The discovery of Dahmer's true nature left Milwaukee and the world in disbelief. How had someone so ordinary been able to commit such unspeakable acts? And how had he gotten away with it for so long? As the investigation into Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes deepened, one question lingered. How could someone so seemingly ordinary, so unremarkable, carry out such brutal and horrifying acts? Dahmer, a quiet, solitary man who lived in a modest apartment, didn't fit the typical image of a serial killer. He wasn't an eccentric loner or a maniacal madman. He was a man who blended in perfectly with those around him. But behind the facade of the quiet mechanic, a monster lurked. Dahmer's childhood had been marked by neglect, isolation, and a troubling pattern of behavior that foreshadowed the darkness within him. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer's early life was characterized by an unsettling lack of warmth or connection. His parents, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, were frequently at odds, and their marriage was strained. Jeffrey was often left feeling rejected and unnoticed, a feeling that would fester into something far more sinister as he grew older. From a young age, Dahmer exhibited signs of disturbed behavior. At the age of 8, he began collecting roadkill and experimenting with animal dissections. His fascination with death became increasingly obsessive, a precursor to the horrors he would later commit. But it wasn't just his fascination with death that set him apart. It was his ability to compartmentalize his actions. Throughout his life, Dahmer was able to suppress the true extent of his dark desires, hiding them behind a veneer of normalcy. To his neighbors, he was just a quiet man who worked at a local chocolate factory. He kept to himself, rarely socializing, and when he did interact with others, it was often in a polite, if distant manner. Dahmer's desire to kill, however, was not something that appeared overnight. It was a gradual evolution. After a brief stint in the army, which ended after Dahmer was discharged for alcohol abuse, he lived in a series of apartments, moving from one place to the next, each time finding a new way to feed his dark urges. His first murder, in 1978, was an impulsive act. Dahmer killed Stephen Hicks, a young hitchhiker, after luring him to his apartment with the promise of alcohol. From there, his killings became more frequent and methodical. What made Dahmer particularly dangerous was his ability to blend into society. He didn't stand out. He wasn't the deranged madman that society expected. He was a man who could look you in the eye and convince you that he was just like anyone else. This ability to appear normal allowed Dahmer to carry out his crimes for years without drawing suspicion. He was not the man you'd expect to be hiding the most gruesome secrets in his home. His apartment became his personal hell, a place where his most horrific acts took place. The dark, cramped spaces held secrets that only Dahmer could understand, and the people who entered his world never left. Dahmer's ability to mask his true self was both chilling and terrifying. As investigators uncovered more about his life, it became clear that he had lived a double life for years, a life that, until that fateful night when Tracy Edwards escaped, had remained hidden from the world.
But as much as Dahmer tried to maintain control over his actions, the truth was beginning to surface. And with every layer peeled back, the world saw more of the monster he had been hiding.
But Dahmer's crimes did not stop with murder. After killing his victims, Dahmer would often engage in acts of necrophilia, violating the bodies before dismembering them. He would then preserve body parts, often keeping them in containers or storing them in his refrigerator. Dahmer's fixation on the human body was not limited to simple dissection. He sought to keep pieces of his victims as trophies. He collected skulls, hands, and genitalia, which he preserved with great care. Dahmer's fascination with death and his compulsion to control his victims did not end with their bodies. He would often go to extreme lengths to disfigure the remains of his victims in an attempt to create what he saw as a permanent bond between himself and his prey. In one of his more grotesque rituals, Dahmer drilled holes into his victims' skulls and injected acid into their brains in an attempt to create zombies, mindless, obedient beings who would serve him forever. His attempt at creating a lasting connection with his victims took on a truly nightmarish quality. As Dahmer's killings escalated, his confidence grew. What started as spontaneous acts of violence gradually turned into a terrifying series of calculated murders. The frequency and brutality of his crimes increased with each victim. Dahmer's need for control over his victims grew stronger, and the violence he inflicted became more elaborate. It was as though he was trying to outdo himself, constantly pushing the boundaries of his depravity. By the time of his arrest, Dahmer had become a skilled manipulator, blending into the shadows of Milwaukee's cityscape. He had built a ritual around his murders, a ritual that allowed him to maintain control over the lives of the men he killed. With each new victim, he grew more brazen, believing that he was untouchable, that no one would ever catch him. He had come to see himself not just as a killer, but someone who could defy the laws of nature itself, creating his own twisted version of life and death. But his reign of terror would not last forever. A mistake, a single misstep, would bring everything crashing down. It was the moment that would reveal Dahmer for what he truly was, not a man, but a monster.
Dahmer, initially calm, tried to downplay the evidence, claiming body parts were sentimental keepsakes. But as the officers found more, the horror of his crimes became undeniable. Dahmer quickly confessed to killing 17 men and boys, detailing his methods in chillingly matter-of-fact terms. He explained how he lured his victims with promises of money or alcohol, then drugged, strangled, and dismembered them, keeping body parts as trophies. The investigation revealed that Dahmer's victims were often marginalized individuals, making their disappearances less noticeable. The public, stunned by the revelation, was left to grapple with the chilling truth that Dahmer had been living among them, hiding his horrors in plain sight. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested, and his capture would lead to a media frenzy. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992, drawing intense attention as the true scale of his crimes became clear. During the trial, Dahmer offered no resistance to the evidence against him, admitting to the murders in graphic detail. His cold, emotionless demeanor contrasted sharply with the anger and grief of the victims' families who filled the courtroom. The prosecution's case was solid, built on Dahmer's confession and the horrifying evidence found in his apartment. Dahmer's defense team, however, argued that he was insane, attempting to shift blame to his troubled upbringing and mental health issues. The psychiatrist's evaluation painted a picture of a man struggling with compulsions he couldn't control. Yet Dahmer himself showed little remorse, even when confronted with the gruesome details of his actions. In February 1992, Dahmer pled guilty but insane to the charges of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. His lack of emotional reaction during sentencing stunned many, leaving his victims' families devastated by the knowledge that he would spend his life in prison without ever truly paying for his crimes. After Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison, the world watched as he became an infamous figure. While incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution, Dahmer's notoriety grew. However, on November 28, 1994, Dahmer was killed by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, who attacked him with a metal bar while the two were cleaning a bathroom together. Dahmer's death brought an eerie sense of closure, but for many, it was unsatisfying. The families of his victims were left with a profound sense of loss and anger, knowing that his crimes could have been prevented. Dahmer's legacy left a lasting impact, leading to changes in police procedures, particularly in how missing persons cases involving marginalized groups were handled. His horrific story sparked numerous books, documentaries, and films, but for those who suffered, the scars remained, unanswered questions still echoing in their minds. If you found this story chilling and compelling, be sure to subscribe for more true crime documentaries every week. Let us dive deeper into the minds of some of history's most notorious criminals. Don't miss out. Subscribe now.